In the silent corridors of corporate power, the most dangerous sound isn't a shouted threat, but the quiet closing of a door on the truth. And sometimes, the person left in the dark is the only one who can see the way out. For Alara Vance, that darkness descended in a conference room bleached of all warmth and color, a sterile glass box on the 34th floor. She sat perfectly still, her hands resting in her lap, a lone island of calm in a sea of her own ruin. Across the polished mahogany table, Marcus Thorne, her director, leaned back with the ghost of a triumphant smile playing on his lips. His words, delivered with a practiced, insincere sympathy, still echoed in the air. Poor performance. Not a good fit for the team's future direction. We have to let you go. Each phrase was a carefully sharpened stone, thrown not to wound, but to kill her career right where she sat Saturday. Next to him, Brenda from Human Resources pushed a thick folder across the table. Her face was a mask of professional indifference, her voice a monotone instrument of corporate policy as she recited the terms of severance, the non-disclosure agreements, the logistics of returning company property. She didn't see a person. She saw a problem being efficiently processed, a loose end being tied. Alara didn't look at the papers. Her gaze was fixed on a point just beyond them, where Liam Kent, her best friend, her confidant, the one person in this entire building she had trusted, stood near the wall, pretending to be fascinated by the gray cityscape outside the window. He wouldn't look at her. He couldn't. He was the architect of this moment, the one who had taken her dreams and presented them as his own, and now he stood by, a silent, cowardly witness to her execution. There were no tears, no desperate pleas, just a silence that grew heavier and more profound with each passing second. It was the silence of a deep, tectonic shift, the kind that happens far beneath the surface, just before the world cracks open. It was the silence of disbelief, hardening into certainty, of heartbreak crystallizing into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. Marcus and Brenda mistook this silence for defeat, for the quiet acceptance of a powerless employee. They couldn't feel the furnace igniting within it. They couldn't see the calculations already beginning behind her calm, dark eyes. The click of the folder being closed was final. The scrape of a chair was a dismissal. A few moments later, the heavy door of the conference room clicked shut behind her, and Alara Vance was officially an outsider, cast out from the world she had given everything to. The sound didn't signal an end. It was a beginning. To understand the depth of the betrayal, you must first understand the quiet world of Alara Vance. She was a woman who found her sanctuary not in people, but in patterns. At Innovate Dynamics, a sprawling tech firm housed in a cathedral of glass and steel in the heart of New York City, Alara was a senior data analyst, though she moved through the aggressively social office with the quiet humility of an intern. While others networked by the artisanal coffee machine or built empires through PowerPoint presentations, Alara built worlds in silence. She saw poetry in Python scripts and found elegant narratives within mountains of raw, chaotic data. For her, a perfectly optimized query was a form of art, a silent testament to an order she could create in a world that often felt disorderly. Her desk, tucked away in a corner far from the boisterous sales floor, was her haven, a small kingdom ruled by logic and precision. This inclination for solitude was not a choice, but a product of her upbringing. Orphaned in a car accident that she barely remembered, Alara was raised by her maternal uncle, Arthur Vance. He was a brilliant but deeply reclusive software engineer, a man who spoke more fluently in C++ than in casual conversation. He taught Alara that a problem, no matter how complex, could be broken down into smaller, manageable parts. He gave her a laptop for her 10th birthday, and with it, a universe to explore. Their small, book-filled apartment was a world away from the corporate ladder climbing that defined her peers. It was a place of quiet study and mutual understanding, where success was measured by the elegance of a solution, not the volume of one's voice. This upbringing made her self-reliant, fiercely intelligent, and utterly naive about the serpentine politics of a place like Innovate Dynamics. She believed, with a devout earnestness, that good work was its own reward, that merit would always, eventually, be recognized. This belief was fueled by a desperate, private motivation. The man who had raised her, her quiet, gentle Uncle Arthur, was now fighting a degenerative neurological disease. The illness was a thief, slowly stealing his sharp mind and his independence. The mounting medical bills were a constant, crushing weight on Alara's shoulders. The standard insurance provided by the company was simply not enough to cover the experimental treatments that offered a sliver of hope. This was the engine that drove her. Every late night spent at the office, every weekend sacrificed to a complex dataset, was a quiet prayer, a down payment on a future where her uncle might get better. The promotion Marcus Thorne had dangled in front of her was not just a career goal, it was a lifeline. It meant better pay, better insurance, and the ability to give the only family she had left a fighting chance. This desperation made her work harder, but it also made her blind. Her one conduit to the social ecosystem of the office was Liam Kent. He was everything she was not: charming, effortlessly confident, and a master of workplace diplomacy. He had a joke for everyone, remembered the names of their kids, and could navigate a tense meeting with the skill of a seasoned politician. They had started at the company in the same week, two young analysts in a sea of sharks. Liam had approached her first, drawn to her obvious brilliance, which she did little to advertise. "You're the silent killer, aren't you?" he'd said with a grin one afternoon, after she'd identified a critical flaw in a system that everyone else had missed. He became her translator, her champion. He would take her complex, technical ideas and frame them in a language the executives could understand and applaud. She saw him as a partner, a true friend in a place where friendships felt transactional. They'd have lunch every day, sitting by the giant windows overlooking the city, Alara sketching out algorithms on a napkin, while Liam talked about his ambitions, his frustrations, his admiration for her mind. "You're the brains, Alara," he'd often say. "I'm just the hype man." She believed him. She trusted him with her vulnerabilities, her fears about her uncle, and most dangerously, with her ideas. Presiding over their department was Marcus Thorne, the director of strategic analysis. Marcus was a corporate chameleon, perfectly adapting his personality to suit his audience. To the C-suite executives, he was a visionary leader. To his team, he was a supportive, empowering mentor, at least on the surface. He cultivated an inner circle, a clique of favored employees who laughed the loudest at his jokes and were always the first to agree with his strategies. Liam, with his social grace, was a natural fit for this circle. Alara was not. Yet Marcus seemed to recognize her talent. He would call her into his glass-walled office for private meetings, closing the door and lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Alara, that report was phenomenal," he'd say. "You're the real engine on this team. Liam does a great job presenting, but we both know who the genius island." He made her feel seen, valued, and then he made the promise. "The team lead position is opening up next quarter," he told her, his eyes gleaming with sincerity. "It's yours to lose. I just need you to bring me something big, something undeniable, a project that will put this whole department on the map." He was baiting the hook, and Alara, driven by her love for her uncle, swam towards it with all her strength, never once thinking to question the nature of the fisherman. And so the stage was set. A brilliant, unassuming woman driven by desperation, a charming and ambitious friend who knew all her secrets, and a manipulative boss who saw his employees not as people, but as pawns in his own game of power. It was a perfect, volatile combination, waiting for a single spark to ignite a tragedy. The project that would come to define Alara's life and unmake it in the same breath was born in the company's digital graveyard. Innovate Dynamics, like most large corporations, collected data voraciously. They had terabytes of it: customer purchase histories, supply chain logistics, social media sentiment analysis, website click-through rates. But this data existed in isolated silos, vast, disconnected continents of information that no one had ever managed to bridge. The official company line was that they were data-driven, but in reality, they were data-drowned. It was this challenge, this grand unsolved puzzle, that captivated Alara. While others saw noise, she heard a faint, discordant symphony, and she became obsessed with the idea of composing it into a masterpiece. The promise Marcus had made to her wasn't just a catalyst, it was the permission she needed to pursue an idea so audacious she had previously kept it to herself. She called it, in her private notes, Project Chimera. The name was perfect. In mythology, the chimera was a creature made of the parts of different animals. Her project was to be a digital chimera, an algorithm that could fuse wildly disparate datasets into a single, cohesive, predictive entity. What if, she wondered, a sudden spike in searches for vintage raincoats in Seattle, combined with a dip in the stock price of a certain coffee bean supplier in Colombia, and a trending melancholic folk playlist on Spotify, could accurately predict a downturn in consumer spending on luxury goods in the Pacific Northwest 3 weeks in advance? It was a lunatic idea, a leap of faith that defied conventional data modeling. But Alara had seen the whispers of these connections in her work, faint ghosts in the machine that everyone else dismissed as statistical anomalies. For 6 months, Project Chimera became her entire world. Her small apartment became a cave of scribbled equations and half-empty coffee mugs. She arrived at the office before the sun rose and often left long after the cleaning crews had finished their rounds, the city lights of New York, a glittering, indifferent backdrop to the glow of her triple-monitor setup. She worked with a feverish intensity, fueled by a mixture of intellectual passion and raw desperation. On her monitor, she kept a small, digitized photo of her Uncle Arthur, smiling on a park bench from years ago, before the illness had taken root. He was her North Star. When her code broke for the 10th time at 3 a.m, when a modeling approach led to a dead end, she would look at that picture and remember why she was there. This wasn't for glory or for Marcus. It was for him. The breakthrough came not with a thunderclap, but with a quiet, elegant whisper. It was a Tuesday night, the office utterly deserted, save for the low hum of the climate control. She had just restructured a key part of the learning algorithm, building a feedback loop inspired by the way neural pathways form in the human brain. She ran the simulation, feeding it historical data from the last 5 years. She held her breath as the program executed, lines of code scrolling past faster than she could read. And then, the results appeared. The model had not only identified every major market shift in the past 5 years, but it had predicted them with an astonishing 87% accuracy weeks before they happened. It worked. A slow smile spread across Ilara's face, a genuine, unburdened smile of pure creation. She had done it. She had built a crystal ball. Initially, she guarded her creation fiercely. It was too precious, too personal to share. But she knew she couldn't keep it to herself. To get the promotion, to save her uncle, Chimera had to be seen. And the only person she trusted to help her reveal it to the world was Liam. She showed it to him in a small, private conference room, her hands trembling slightly as she walked him through the model. Liam's reaction was everything she had hoped for. His eyes widened, his usual casual demeanor replaced by a look of genuine awe. He didn't just understand it, he was electrified by it. "Ilara, do you have any idea what you've done?" he whispered, leaning closer to the screen. "This isn't just a project. This is a revolution. This changes everything." He leapt to his feet, pacing the room with nervous energy. "Marcus will lose his mind. The board will. They'll build a statue of you in the lobby." He made her feel like a hero. His belief in her, so vocal and enthusiastic, washed away her own insecurities. Over the next few weeks, Liam became Chimera's self-appointed co-pilot. "You focus on refining the algorithm, making your baby perfect," he insisted. "Let me handle the corporate nonsense. The presentations, the business proposals. I can make this thing sing for the suits." It seemed like the perfect partnership. Alara, the introverted genius, could remain in her element, while Liam, the charismatic showman, would build the stage. He was meticulous, spending hours with her as she explained the nuances of the code. He asked endless questions, not just about what it did, but how it did it, his curiosity seeming to stem from a deep admiration for her intellect. He designed a stunning presentation deck, full of sleek graphics and powerful taglines that distilled her complex work into digestible, exciting sound bites. He was her champion, her advocate, and her friend. The final, fatal act of trust came a week before the big presentation. Alara received a call from the care facility. Her uncle had had a bad fall and was being taken to the hospital. Panic seized her, cold and sharp. She told Liam she had to leave immediately, her voice cracking. Go, don't worry about a thing, he said, his voice a soothing balm of reassurance. I'll handle everything here. Just focus on your uncle. An hour later, as she sat in the sterile, anxious quiet of the hospital waiting room, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Liam. Hey, so sorry to bother you. Hope everything's okay. While I'm polishing the presentation, I noticed some of your source files have inconsistent formatting. If you want, I can go through and clean it all up, add comments, make it look perfect for the technical review. Just need full admin access to your project directory on the server. Reading the message, Alara felt a wave of gratitude. Even now, he was thinking of her, trying to lessen her burden. It was such a small, helpful gesture. Without a second of hesitation, sitting under the flickering fluorescent lights of the hospital, she typed in her credentials on her phone and granted him complete, unrestricted access to her life's work. You're a lifesaver, Liam. Thank you, she texted back. His reply came almost instantly. That's what friends are for. The morning of the presentation, the air in the Innovate Dynamics office was electric, with a high-stakes tension that Alara could feel in her bones. This wasn't a standard departmental update. This was a command performance. The meeting was scheduled in the Celestial Boardroom on the 40th floor, a room reserved for decisions that could alter the company's trajectory. The Chief Technology Officer would be there, along with the COO and a handful of senior vice presidents whose schedules were guarded like state secrets. Alara had dressed with deliberate care, choosing a simple, professional outfit that made her feel confident but not conspicuous. In her bag, she carried a worn, leather-bound notebook filled with her handwritten notes, the physical manifestation of 6 months of her life. She was a storm of nerves and adrenaline, but beneath it all was a current of profound excitement. This was her moment. This was for Arthur. Liam met her by the elevators, a vision of calm and charisma in a perfectly tailored suit. He handed her a coffee. Deep breaths. Superstar, he said, with a reassuring wink. You're going to walk in there and blow them away. Just stick to the script we practiced. You've got this. His confidence was infectious, and she felt a wave of gratitude for his friendship. He was her rock in this nerve-wracking sea. They rode the elevator up in a comfortable silence, the city shrinking beneath them. As the doors opened to the executive floor, they saw Marcus Thorne waiting for them, his expression uncharacteristically serious. He gestured for them to step into a small alcove, away from the gathering executives. All right, team, he began, his voice low. Quick strategy update. I've made a game-time decision. Liam, you're going to lead the presentation. The words didn't register at first. Alara felt a jolt of confusion, as if he'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. What? She managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. Marcus, we practiced. I'm ready. Marcus held up a hand, a placating gesture that felt intensely dismissive. I know you are, Alara, and your work is the foundation of all of this. But this is about salesmanship as much as it is about science. Liam has a natural command of these audiences. We need to play to our strengths. It's what's best for the project. He was framing it as a strategic choice, a simple matter of logistics. Alara looked at Liam, searching for an ally, but he just gave a slight, helpless shrug. I told him you should do it, Alara, Liam said, his voice laced with a convincing imitation of regret. But the boss gets the final say. We have to trust his judgment. It was a perfectly executed maneuver, boxing her in, making any further protests seem like she was being difficult, like she wasn't a team player. Dumbstruck and cornered, she could only nod, the notebook in her hands suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. Walking into the boardroom felt like entering a dream that was rapidly turning into a nightmare. She took a seat at the long, polished table, while Liam and Marcus took their places at the front, connecting the laptop to the main screen. The presentation file, The one Liam had so beautifully designed was titled Chimera Final V7. Her name was nowhere on the title slide. It simply read, Project Chimera, a new paradigm in predictive analytics, followed by presenter Liam Kent, strategic analysis. Then Marcus kicked things off. Good morning, everyone, he began, his voice booming with confidence. For the past several months, my team has been working on something truly transformative. I want to give special credit to Liam Kent, who brought the seeds of this idea to me and has shown incredible leadership and vision in bringing it to life. The lie was so bold, so audacious, that Alara felt the air leave her lungs. This wasn't a change of plans. This was a coup. Then Liam began to speak, and the world tilted on its axis. He was magnificent. He was charming, passionate, and utterly convincing. But the words coming out of his mouth were not his own. They were hers. He started with the opening she had agonized over for a week, the analogy of the digital graveyard. He used the exact phrasing she had rehearsed to him in their small practice sessions, the cadence and rhythm she had perfected. He was performing a script that she had written with her own soul. With each slide, the theft became more profound, more absolute. When I started looking at the disconnected data, he said, gesturing to a complex diagram she had designed, I asked a simple question. What if we're looking for the wrong thing? He talked about the late nights, the challenges, the moment of breakthrough, narrating her experiences as if they were his memories. He never once said we. He never once mentioned a team. It was always I, me, my. Alara sat frozen, a silent spectator at the public auction of her own identity. A cold dread, thick and suffocating, rose in her chest. Each word he spoke was a fresh stab of betrayal. She remembered the exact moment she had conceived that turn of phrase, sitting in her apartment, at 2 a.m. She remembered explaining that complex concept to him, her hands moving excitedly as she tried to make him see the beauty of the structure. He had listened so intently, absorbed everything so completely, not as a friend, but as a predator studying its prey. The executives were enthralled. They leaned forward, captivated by the story he was weaving, the story of a lone genius who had tamed the chaos of their data. At one point, the CTO interrupted with a sharp technical question about the algorithm's core logic. Alara's heart seized. This was it. This was where he would falter. He couldn't possibly know the answer. But he did. He answered it perfectly, concisely, using the exact explanation she had given him when he'd asked the very same question just days before. He had memorized everything. He had left nothing to chance. Near the end of the presentation, as he was delivering the powerful concluding remarks, she had written words about turning data into prophecy. His eyes swept across the room. For a single, horrifying second, his gaze met hers. There was no apology in his eyes, no guilt, no fear. There was only a flash of cold, calculating triumph, an unmistakable glint of victory before he looked away. And in that moment, Alara finally understood. This was not a betrayal born of opportunity. This was a premeditated assassination, planned and executed with ruthless precision. The presentation ended. The room erupted in applause. The executives were on their feet, crowding around Liam, shaking his hand, patting him on the back. Marcus stood beside him, beaming, accepting congratulations as the proud mentor. And Alara just sat there, invisible, the sound of their celebration ringing in her ears like a funeral bell. Her project was a success. Her career was over. For 2 days, Alara existed in a state of suspended animation. The shock from the presentation had left her numb, moving through her workdays on autopilot, the ambient noise of the office sounding distant and distorted, as if she were underwater. She watched as Liam was celebrated, as Marcus paraded him through meetings as the company's newest prodigy. She saw the congratulatory emails, the pats on the back, the casual way Liam accepted credit for the sleepless nights that belonged to her. The numbness, however, was a temporary shield. Beneath it, something else was taking shape. It was a cold, hard anger, an indignation so pure and powerful it burned away the fog of her despair. They had not just stolen her work, they had stolen her voice, her past, her future. They had tried to erase her. And as she sat at her desk on the 3rd day, Staring at the cheerful, corporate screensaver bouncing across her monitor, she made a decision. She would not be erased. Her analytical mind, once dedicated to finding patterns in market data, now turned to a new, singular purpose: justice. She would not confront them directly. That would be her word against a director and his chosen star. Instead, she would trust the system that was supposedly built to prevent such things. She would go to human resources. She spent an entire night meticulously preparing her case, treating it like the most important project of her life. She was no longer a victim. She was a prosecutor building an indictment. She created a precise timeline, cross-referencing her work server logs with her email records. There it was, inarguable and clear. File creation dates for the core Chimera algorithm predating any of Liam's contributions by months. She printed out email chains where she had explained key concepts to Liam, him responding with, "Wow, that's brilliant," long before he would later claim the ideas as his own. She even had the metadata from her presentation drafts, a digital breadcrumb trail that showed her as the sole author, with Liam's edits only appearing in the final cosmetic stages. She gathered her handwritten notes, the pages filled with her frantic scrawls and diagrams. To her, it was an open and shut case. The data told a story, and the data never lied. The office of Brenda, the head of human resources, was a testament to curated insincerity. The walls were painted a calming but soulless shade of beige. Behind her desk, a series of framed posters displayed corporate buzzwords like integrity, Colorado elaboration, and innovation. It felt less like an office and more like a carefully designed set for a play about a functional workplace. Brenda herself was the lead actress. She greeted Alara with a practiced, sympathetic smile and offered her a bottle of water. "Thank you for coming in, Alara," she began, her voice smooth and professional. "I understand you have some concerns about the Chimera project. This is a safe space. Please, feel free to unpack what's on your mind." Alara, clinging to a fragile hope, took a deep breath and began. She laid out her case with the same logical precision she used in her data analyses. She didn't raise her voice. She presented her evidence, piece by piece, the printed emails, the screenshots of the file histories, the timeline. She explained the genesis of the idea, the months of solitary work, her trust in Liam, and the ultimate public betrayal. Brenda listened, nodding periodically, her expression a perfect mask of neutral concern. She took a few notes on a legal pad. When Alara finished, her evidence stacked neatly on the table between them, a profound silence filled the room. Alara waited for a reaction shock, perhaps, or even professional outrage. Instead, Brenda leaned back in her leather chair and steepled her fingers. "Thank you, Alara. I appreciate you sharing your perspective," she said, her tone shifting from listening mode to assessment mode. "I've also taken the liberty of speaking with both Marcus and Liam to get a fuller, 360-degree view of the situation." She paused, picking up one of Alara's printed emails. "The challenge here, as I see it, is one of interpretation. In a highly collaborative environment, ideas often cross-pollinate. What one person sees as sole authorship, another might see as a team effort." She systematically began to dismantle Alara's case, not with evidence, but with doubt and corporate jargon. The emails could be seen as a brainstorming session. The file creation dates? That shows you started the initial framework, but Marcus and Liam maintain that the project was fundamentally reshaped and made viable by Liam's strategic vision. The floor began to fall away beneath Alara's feet. Brenda was not an impartial judge. She was the company's defense attorney. The final, devastating blow came when Brenda pointed to the server logs Alara herself had provided. "And this is the most challenging piece of data for your narrative, Alara," she said, her voice devoid of any real sympathy. "The records are clear that you voluntarily granted Mr. Kent full administrative access to all project files a week before the presentation. From a risk management perspective, that action is inconsistent with the claim that this was a proprietary, solo project. It suggests a level of partnership and trust that contradicts the story you're telling now." She had taken Alara's single greatest act of friendship and twisted it into a weapon against her. She made it her fault. The meeting was over. Brenda transitioned smoothly into her closing statement, the professional mask now hardening into a cold, clear warning. "Alara, you are a valued analyst here," she said, though the words sounded hollow. "My advice, both as an HR professional and for the sake of your own career, is to be very careful. Marcus Thorne is a senior director. Liam Kent is now seen as one of the company's brightest rising stars. Making these kinds of serious, unsubstantiated accusations against them can create a perception of you as someone who is not a team player. It could significantly impact your future here. My official recommendation is that we categorize this as a communication breakdown and implement a mediation session to improve team dynamics moving forward." The offer of mediation was the final insult, a suggestion that the problem was a simple squabble between equals and not a grand theft larceny of her intellectual property. The message, however, was not in her words, but in the space between them. "Drop it. We have already chosen our winner. You have already lost." Alara walked out of that sterile beige office, feeling a cold that had nothing to do with the overactive air conditioning. The system she had placed her faith in had not just failed her, it had actively sided with her abusers. She was utterly and completely alone. The aftermath of the meeting with Brenda was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, creeping poison that seeped into every corner of Ilara's work life. The official ruling of a communication breakdown had been a lie, a corporate euphemism for a verdict that had already been rendered. Alara Vance was guilty. Her crime was not underperformance or insubordination. Her crime was that she had refused to be a silent victim. And for that, she was sentenced to a professional death by 1,000 cuts. The Whisper campaign began almost immediately, a masterful and insidious operation orchestrated by Marcus and performed by Liam. The narrative they spun was a tragic tale of ambition and delusion. Alara, they implied, was a brilliant but unstable contributor who had become fixated on her friend's success, falsely believing his ideas were her own. The effects were immediate and devastating. Conversations would halt abruptly when she approached the coffee machine, resuming in hushed tones only after she had walked away. Colleagues who once greeted her with a friendly hello now found the floor intensely interesting when she passed, their eyes darting away as if her gaze were contagious. She was an invisible presence in meetings she was still invited to, her input ignored, her questions met with brief, dismissive answers. More often, she simply wasn't invited at all, learning about key project updates only when a summary email was sent out to the entire department. The office, once a place of intellectual stimulation, became a hostile territory, a social minefield where every corner held a new, invisible rejection. She was a ghost haunting the halls of her own career, forced to watch the life she had built continue on without her. Liam, in particular, played his role with a sickening theatrical brilliance. He was not the gloating victor, but the wounded victim. He projected an air of profound sadness, as if he were the one who had been betrayed. He would confide in colleagues in hushed, somber tones, just loud enough for Alara to overhear from her desk. "I just don't know what happened," he would sigh, shaking his head. "I thought we were a team. I thought she was my friend. To have her turn on me like this, it's just heartbreaking." He weaponized their shared history, twisting every memory of their collaboration into evidence of his generosity and her subsequent treachery. He garnered immense sympathy, casting himself as the magnanimous genius forced to endure the bitter jealousy of a less talented peer. This performance was his masterstroke, as it didn't just isolate Alara professionally, it assassinated her character, ensuring that no one would ever listen to her side of the story. With HR having officially sanctioned the narrative that Alara was a problem, Marcus was free to begin the systematic process of managing her out. His methods were cruel in their mundanity. Her work, once the challenging and groundbreaking analysis she thrived on, was replaced by a soul-crushing stream of menial tasks. She was assigned to data hygiene projects, spending entire weeks verifying columns in spreadsheets from years past. She was tasked with writing up documentation for defunct legacy systems, work that was both tedious and utterly pointless. It was a clear and deliberate message. Your talent is worthless to us now. You are being punished. For the rare, substantive tasks she did receive, the conditions were designed for failure. Marcus would assign her a complex report at 4 o'clock on a Friday and demand it be on his desk by 9 a.m. Monday, knowing full well it was an impossible timeline. The public humiliation was relentless. In team meetings, he would single her out, his tone dripping with condescending concern. "Alara, could you walk us through your methodology on this?" he'd ask, after she presented a simple data pull. "We need to be extra careful with accuracy on your assignments from now on." He would interrupt her, question her basic competence in front of the entire team, and then conclude with a patronizing, "Just want to make sure you feel supported." He was creating a public paper trail of her incompetence, building a case for her eventual termination brick by painful brick. Each meeting was a fresh ordeal, a new exercise in holding her composure while being slowly dissected under the cold, indifferent gazes of her former colleagues. For weeks, Alara felt herself starting to fracture under the pressure. The constant gaslighting was a potent poison. She would lie awake at night, replaying every conversation, every interaction, the confident assertions of Marcus and Liam echoing in her mind. Had she been naive? Had she misinterpreted their collaboration? Was she, in fact, the delusional, unstable person they were painting her to be? The isolation was a breeding ground for self-doubt, and it nearly consumed her. What pulled her back from the edge was the very thing they were trying to crush, her analytical mind. One evening, after a particularly brutal meeting, she went home not in tears, but with a cold, clear resolve. She opened a new, encrypted file on her personal laptop. The file was not for HR, and it was not a complaint. It was an analysis. She began to document everything, not as a victim, but as a scientist observing a hostile ecosystem. She logged every demeaning email from Marcus, every backhanded comment from Liam, every snub from a colleague, noting the date, the time, the context. She stopped trying to win their approval or prove her sanity. Instead, she became a ghost of a different kind. She retreated into a shell of calm, professional indifference. She performed her menial tasks with flawless precision. She responded to Marcus's provocations with brief, emotionless, factual statements. She did her work, kept her head down, and watched. This quiet, unreadable composure seemed to frustrate them more than her tears or anger ever could have. They had expected her to break, to quit, to have a dramatic outburst that would justify their actions. She did none of those things. She endured. She needed the paycheck for her uncle, whose condition was worsening. That singular, desperate need was the bedrock that kept her from shattering. She was trapped in her corporate prison, but she was no longer just a prisoner. She was a student, learning the brutal language of power, deceit, and survival. They thought they were burying her, but they were only teaching her how to live in the dark. The campaign of psychological warfare had taken its toll on Alara, but it had not achieved its primary objective. She was still there. Her quiet, stoic endurance had become a silent form of defiance, a daily reminder to Marcus and Liam of their own treachery. Her continued presence was an inconvenience, a loose thread in the perfect narrative they had woven. It was clear to them that attrition was not enough. They needed a definitive, undeniable reason to sever her from the company, a public execution that would leave no room for doubt or appeal. They needed a guillotine, and Marcus was more than willing to build it. He called her into his office one morning. His demeanor shifted from condescending mentor to that of a stern, impatient commander. There was a new project, he explained, a quarterly financial forecast for one of their key enterprise clients. It was a high-visibility, high-stakes assignment. The analysis you provide will be part of a deck going directly to the client's board, Marcus stated, his eyes cold and unblinking. There is zero room for error. I'm giving you this, Alara, as a final opportunity to demonstrate the level of competence and attention to detail that we expect from a senior analyst. The subtext was as subtle as a sledgehammer. This was her last chance. A flicker of something that felt dangerously like hope sparked within her. This wasn't a menial task. It was real work, important work. Perhaps, just perhaps, if she executed it with absolute perfection, she could claw back a fraction of her lost credibility. The trap, of course, was not in the assignment itself, which was well within her capabilities, but in the materials she would be given to complete it. Later that day, a junior analyst named Kevin, a nervous young man who owed his recent promotion to Marcus, approached her desk. He avoided her eyes, mumbling something about Marcus, asking him to compile the source data for her forecast. He sent her a link to a folder on the shared server. "Everything you need should be in there," he said quickly, before scurrying away as if her desk were radioactive. Ilara, focused on the task ahead and the impossibly tight 48-hour deadline Marcus had imposed, who didn't have time to dwell on Kevin's strange behavior. She downloaded the datasets and began to work. For the first time in months, she felt a ghost of her old self return. The familiar rhythm of analysis, the challenge of weaving raw numbers into a coherent forecast, was a balm to her bruised spirit. She worked with a desperate, meticulous focus, the glow of her monitor, a solitary light in the otherwise dark office as she stayed late into the night. She did notice a few minor inconsistencies in the data, tiny aberrations that pricked at the edge of her analytical intuition. A quarterly growth number that seemed slightly too high, a customer churn rate that felt a little too low. But the source files were labeled as finalized and approved, and the anomalies were subtle enough to be dismissed as standard market fluctuations. With the crushing deadline breathing down her neck, she didn't have the luxury of performing a full forensic audit on data that had supposedly already been vetted. She had to trust the materials she was given. Her own professionalism and the ticking clock became unwitting accomplices in her downfall. She built her forecast, a beautiful, logical, and elegant analysis based entirely on a foundation of lies. She submitted the report with 10 minutes to spare, feeling a profound sense of exhaustion, but also a sliver of pride in the work she had produced under immense pressure. The trap was sprung the following afternoon in a pre-presentation review meeting with the entire team. Marcus projected Ilara's final summary slide onto the main screen. He let it hang there for a moment, then feigned a look of confusion. "Hold on a second," he said, his voice laced with theatrical disbelief. "That revenue projection, it can't be right. It's almost 5% higher than our internal estimates." He turned to Kevin. "Kevin, do me a favor. Pull up the raw sales ledger for Q3. Kevin, playing his role perfectly, brought up another spreadsheet on the screen. The numbers were starkly different. The room fell silent. Marcus zoomed in on a key metric in Ilara's report and the corresponding, correct figure in the raw data. The discrepancy was undeniable, a glaring error that made her entire forecast and, by extension, her look utterly incompetent. Marcus exploded. It was a masterful performance of righteous fury. "What is this?" he roared, slamming his hand on the table, making everyone jump. "This is what we're planning to show to our biggest client? A report based on fantasy numbers? This is unacceptable. This jeopardizes the entire account. Ilara, what do you have to say for yourself?" All eyes turned to her. She felt the blood drain from her face as the perfect, horrific clarity of the setup washed over her. The data," she stammered. "That's the data I was given by Kevin." Marcus scoffed, turning her defense into an admission of guilt. "So you're saying you just blindly trust any data you're given? You don't verify? You don't cross-reference? That's the standard of a senior analyst at this company?" The final meeting, the one she knew was coming, took place an hour later in Brenda's cold, beige office. It was a grim reunion. There was no pretense of investigation this time. Her flawed report lay on the table between them, like a death sentence. "Gross negligence," Brenda said, her voice flat and clinical. "This error is of a magnitude that we simply cannot overlook. It demonstrates a fundamental lack of the skills required for your position." Ilara tried to argue, to explain the setup, the data, the impossible deadline, but her words were meaningless. They had their proof, the fireable offense they had so carefully manufactured. Marcus delivered the final, cutting blow. "Honestly, Ilara, this is a relief," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "We can't afford to have this kind of liability on the team. This decision is effective immediately." The rest was a blur of procedural coldness. She was handed a box and escorted back to her desk by a silent security guard. As she packed the few personal items that had marked her territory, a photo of her and Uncle Arthur, a chipped mug, a small, resilient succulent, she could feel the eyes of the entire office on her. No one spoke. No one moved to help. She was a pariah, a cautionary tale. As she walked past Liam's desk, she glanced over. He was staring intently at his screen, his fingers frozen over his keyboard, refusing to grant her even the dignity of a final look. He had already erased her. The security guard led her to the elevator, down to the lobby, and out through the massive glass doors onto the bustling New York street. She stood there on the pavement, holding the cardboard box of her terminated career, the roar of the city, a deafening symphony of her own failure. She had hit rock bottom. The world she knew had ended. The weeks that followed were a descent into a gray, featureless abyss. Alara's world, once defined by the sharp, clean logic of data and code, had dissolved into a blurry landscape of unemployment and despair. She spent her days in the suffocating quiet of her small apartment, cycling through the hollow rituals of the jobless. She would send out dozens of applications, her meticulously crafted resume and cover letters disappearing into the digital void, rarely warranting even an automated rejection email. She suspected Marcus was poisoning the well, that a single phone call from him was enough to brand her as incompetent or unstable, a toxic asset to be avoided. Her savings dwindled with an alarming speed. Each grocery bill and rent payment, a fresh wave of panic. The city, once a glittering backdrop of opportunity, now felt like a cold, indifferent beast, and she was just one more casualty it was preparing to devour. The true weight of her failure, however, was not felt in her empty inbox or her dwindling bank account, but in the sterile, antiseptic-scented halls of her uncle's care facility. His health had taken a sharp decline, the progression of his illness accelerating in a way that terrified her. The experimental treatments she had dreamed of funding were now an impossible fantasy. She could barely afford his current care. She would sit by his bedside for hours, holding his frail hand, forcing a bright smile as she recounted fabricated stories of success at work, of exciting new projects and challenging assignments. Lying to the one person who had taught her the value of truth was a special kind of hell, a constant, bitter reminder of how completely she had been broken. He was her reason for everything, and she was failing him. Her shame was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest until it was hard to breathe. The first phone call came on a Tuesday, a day so bleak and rainy it seemed to have been designed by a poet of misery. It was the head nurse from the facility. Her uncle had suffered a massive stroke. He had passed away peacefully in his sleep. The words were delivered with professional gentleness, but they struck Alara with the force of a physical blow. The phone slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor. The gray world went black. She had lost everything. Her career, her reputation, her savings, they were just things. He was her anchor, her history, her home. Without him, she was not just unemployed. She was an orphan all over again, adrift in a world that had proven itself to be merciless. She was still shrouded in that thick, disorienting fog of grief 2 days later when the second call came. The voice on the other end was formal, precise, and utterly out of place in her world of sorrow. It was a man named David Sterling, a senior partner at the law firm of Sterling, Cromwell, and Finch. He was the executor of the estate of Arthur Vance and requested her presence for a meeting at his office at her earliest convenience. It was a matter of some urgency. Alara agreed, her mind too numb to process much beyond the simple logistics of time and address. She assumed it was about her uncle's small apartment, his collection of old books, the modest pension he had left behind. The law firm's name seemed far too grand for such simple affairs. The offices of Sterling, Cromwell, and Finch were in a pre-war building in Midtown, a world of dark wood paneling, worn Persian rugs, and the quiet, intimidating hum of old money. It smelled of leather and paper and gravitas. David Sterling was an older man with kind eyes and a calm, respectful demeanor that was a world away from the corporate predators she had grown accustomed to. He led her into a large, book-lined office and offered her tea, treating her not like a grieving, unemployed woman, but like a distinguished client. After offering his sincere condolences, he got straight to the point. "Alara," he began, his voice gentle, "I was your uncle's lawyer for over 30 years. There is a great deal about his life that he chose to keep private. He was, as you know, a brilliant man, but he was also a profoundly humble one. Mr. Sterling slid a thick, leather-bound folder across his desk. What you probably don't know, he continued, is that your uncle was the co-founder and lead software architect of a highly successful startup in the late 90s called Core Analytics. He paused, letting the words sink in. They developed a foundational data processing technology that was years ahead of its time. Revolutionary, in fact. Alara stared at him, bewildered. A startup? Her quiet, reclusive uncle? It made no sense. About 12 years ago, Mr. Sterling went on, Core Analytics was acquired in a multi-million-dollar deal by a larger, publicly traded tech company. That company was Innovate Dynamics. The name of the company hit her like a punch to the gut. She felt a wave of dizziness. Mr. Sterling, seeming to understand her shock, continued. Arthur disliked the corporate world. He had no interest in a big cash payout or a fancy executive title. Instead of taking the buyout, he negotiated a deal that was, in his words, more structurally sound. He took his payment entirely in company stock, a significant, controlling interest, and a permanent, non-expiring seat on their board of directors. Alara's mind reeled, struggling to connect the quiet man who taught her how to code with this secret titan of industry. A board member? At Innovate Dynamics? He rarely attended meetings, Mr. Sterling explained. He preferred to be a silent partner, a ghost in the machine. He called his seat his emergency brake, a way to intervene if he felt the company was losing its ethical or innovative soul. And, as his sole living relative and designated heir, his will is very clear. You, Alara, inherit his entire estate. The apartment, the savings, his stock portfolio, and his seat on the board. The room was silent, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Grief, shock, and a strange, terrifying new emotion swirled within her. The lawyer's words hung in the air, rearranging the entire fabric of her reality. She was not powerless. She was not a victim. She was, in a way she could never have imagined, one of the most powerful people at the very company that had tried to destroy her. She left the law office in a daze, the heavy legal documents in her briefcase feeling like both a tombstone and a crown. In the taxi back to her apartment, she was caught in traffic, and her cab stopped directly in front of the Innovate Dynamics tower. It loomed over her, a monument of glass and steel that had been the site of her greatest triumphs and her most profound humiliation. She looked at it, and for the first time, she did not feel small. The grief for her uncle was a sharp, searing pain in her chest, but now it was accompanied by something else. It was a cold, clear, and absolute sense of purpose. They thought they had buried her. They had no idea she had just inherited the whole cemetery. The month that followed was not a period of healing, but one of forging. Grief was the fire, and the stunning revelations from Mr. Sterling's office were the hammer, beating Alara's shattered spirit into something new, something hard and sharp. She moved into her uncle's apartment, a quiet sanctuary filled with books on mathematics, philosophy, and computer science. In clearing out his life, she found he had left her more than just a fortune. He had left her an arsenal. Tucked away in his study were years of personal journals, filled not with emotional reflection, but with his sharp, incisive, and often cynical analysis of the corporate world he had so carefully avoided. He had dissected Innovate Dynamics from afar, his notes detailing the political alliances, the hidden vanities of its executives, and the structural weaknesses he saw in its foundation. It was a complete psychological and strategic blueprint of her enemy. These journals became her Bible. Her days transformed into a rigorous self-imposed training regimen. The obsessive focus she had once poured into Project Chimera was now redirected with chilling intensity. She devoured the mountains of paperwork Mr. Sterling provided, a decade's worth of board meeting minutes, shareholder reports, internal audits, and strategic plans. Her analytical mind, once used to build predictive models, was now used to deconstruct the power dynamics of the company. She learned the names of every key player, their histories, their loyalties, and their vulnerabilities. She traced the flow of money, the patterns of promotions, the ghosts of failed projects. She was no longer just a data analyst. She was becoming a corporate strategist, learning the terrain of the battlefield she was about to step onto. This internal transformation was mirrored by an external one. Using a small fraction of her newfound inheritance, she methodically rebuilt her identity from the outside in. She packed away her old clothes, the sensible, unassuming outfits of Alara Vance, the analyst, and replaced them with the armor of a woman of power. The wardrobe was a carefully curated collection of bespoke suits in shades of charcoal and midnight blue, silk blouses, and elegant, minimalist dresses. The clothes were not meant to be loud. They were meant to be undeniable, projecting an aura of quiet authority and untouchable confidence. She had her long, practical hair cut into a sharp, sophisticated style that framed her face and highlighted the new, focused intensity in her eyes. One morning, she looked at her reflection, and for the first time, she did not see the ghost of the girl who had been escorted out of the Innovate Dynamics building. She saw a stranger, a woman she was still getting to know, someone whose silence was no longer a shield, but a weapon. On the advice of Mr. Sterling, she made a final, critical change. "Your uncle's holdings are managed through a trust I established for him years ago, the Vance Sterling Trust," the lawyer had explained. "Legally, your seat on the board is as the trust's representative. Using the full name, Vance Sterling, is not only appropriate, it will create a necessary distinction. It will give you a clean slate." The name felt right. It was a tribute to the man who had unknowingly given her this chance and a shield against the past. Alara Vance was dead. Long live Alara Vance Sterling. Her return to the Innovate Dynamics Tower was the polar opposite of her departure. She was not escorted by a guard, she was accompanied by David Sterling himself. The glass doors that had once closed on her now swung open before her. She was not heading to the bustling, open-plan offices of the 34th floor, but to the hushed, carpeted sanctum of the executive wing on the 40th floor. The CEO, Charles Kensington, a man whose face she had only ever seen in company-wide emails, was waiting for them. Kensington was a veteran of corporate politics, a man with a silver mane and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He offered his condolences for Arthur's passing, his words smooth and practiced, while his eyes were busy sizing her up, trying to gauge the nature of this unexpected new variable that had just appeared on his board. He likely expected a grieving, naive heiress he could easily manage. He was not prepared for the woman who met his gaze. "We are, of course, deeply saddened by the loss, and we are delighted to welcome you, Miss Vance Sterling," Kensington said, his voice a polished purr. "Your uncle was a foundational, if quiet, part of this company's history. We look forward to honoring his legacy with you." Alara simply inclined her head, her expression calm and unreadable. "Thank you for your condolences, Mr. Kensington," she replied, her voice even and measured, betraying none of the turbulent history she had with this building. "I am here to learn and to protect my uncle's investment." The last four words were delivered with a quiet, almost imperceptible emphasis, a subtle but unmistakable signal that she was not there to be a passive observer. As their meeting concluded, and Mr. Sterling was discussing a follow-up with Kensington's assistant, Alara stepped into the hallway, and then it happened. Down the corridor, walking with his signature arrogant stride and speaking loudly into his phone, was Marcus Thorne. He was on his way to his own corner of the executive floor, a place of power she never knew he occupied. He was so consumed by his own self-importance that he barely registered her presence. His eyes flickered over her for a fraction of a second, his brain processing her only as an unfamiliar obstacle in his path before he looked away, completely oblivious. He saw a well-dressed woman, perhaps a client or a new hire from another division, and dismissed her from his reality. He saw her, but he did not see her. Alara, however, saw him with a blinding, terrifying clarity. She saw the man who had patronized her, who had lied to her, who had conspired to ruin her. She felt no fear, no anger, just a profound, chilling calm. The game had changed. He was still playing on the old board, thinking he was a king, He had no idea a new queen had just been placed on the opposite side, watching his every move, and that she already knew exactly how she was going to win. Alara's strategy was not one of overt aggression, but of insidious, creeping precision. She understood that power, especially in a corporate setting, was not about loud proclamations, but about the quiet, unassailable leverage of facts. She spent her first few weeks as a board member in a state of calculated observation, a silent, attentive presence in meetings, speaking only to ask clarifying, intelligent questions. The other board members, mostly older men who had initially been wary of her, began to relax. They saw a bright, serious young woman, perhaps a bit out of her depth, but someone who was dutifully learning the ropes. They underestimated her, and that was her most powerful advantage. She allowed their assumptions to become a cloak of invisibility, shielding her true purpose. Her first major move came during her second board meeting. The agenda was a tedious review of quarterly earnings. Alara waited patiently until the end, under the new business item. When the chairman acknowledged her, she didn't launch into an accusation. She didn't mention her history. She spoke in the calm, measured language of fiduciary duty. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice even and clear. "As the new representative of one of the company's significant long-term shareholders, I feel it is my primary duty to ensure the robust health and integrity of our investments. In the spirit of transparency and good governance, I propose we commission a full, independent, third-party audit of all major research and development projects initiated in the last 2 fiscal years." A few of the older members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Audits were expensive and disruptive. "My intention is not to question our leadership," she continued smoothly, preempting their objections, "but to provide them with the best possible data. A thorough review will allow us to optimize resource allocation, protect our intellectual property assets, and ensure maximum return on investment for our shareholders. Think of it as a routine health checkup for our most vital organs." She had framed it in their own language, using words like ROI, governance, and shareholder value. To argue against such a reasonable, fiscally responsible proposal would be to suggest one had something to hide. With reluctant, grumbling assent, the motion was passed. Alara did not use the company's long-standing auditors, who had cozy relationships with the existing management. Instead, she invoked a clause in the corporate bylaws, one her uncle had noted in his journals, that allowed any board member to allocate funds for independent counsel. She hired a firm named Argent Forensic Solutions, a boutique outfit of former federal prosecutors and intelligence agency-level cyber investigators known for their ruthlessness and discretion. In her initial meeting with the lead investigator, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Maria Flores, Alara gave them a broad mandate but a very specific starting point. "Begin with the Strategic Analysis Department," she instructed. "Focus on any project that received an unscheduled budget increase or was fast-tracked in the last year. I want a full workup, digital forensics, expense reports, everything. Follow the data and follow the money. Report the facts to me, and only to me." The Argent team descended into the digital guts of Innovate Dynamics like a pack of silent wolves. They worked from a secure off-site location, pulling data from the company's servers in the dead of night. For Marcus and Liam, life continued as normal. Liam was the new golden boy, his star rapidly ascending. Marcus was taking credit for mentoring him. They were blissfully unaware that their entire digital lives were being meticulously exhumed. The first report from Flores came 2 weeks later. The digital forensics team had struck gold. By analyzing the deep server archives, they had recovered the shadow copies of Alara's original files for Project Chimera. The metadata was irrefutable, a digital fingerprint proving she had created the core architecture months before Liam's name was ever associated with the project. They found fragments of deleted emails in which she had detailed her breakthroughs, sent from her workstation to Liam's. The evidence was a complete, time-stamped history of her creation and his theft. That alone would have been enough, but it was the forensic accountants who uncovered the rot beneath the floorboards. As they scrutinized the ballooning budget of Project Chimera, they flagged a series of large, recurring payments to a new third-party vendor, a consulting firm called Kent Strategic Solutions, LLC. The name was an act of pure arrogance. A quick search revealed the LLC was a shell company registered just 6 months prior. The address was a mailbox rental store in Delaware. The company's sole officer was a man named Robert Miller, who, after a bit more digging, was discovered to be Liam Kent's brother-in-law. The invoices were for vague, undefined strategic consulting and data acquisition services, totaling over $400,000. The money was then traced from the LLC's bank account to 2 offshore accounts, one belonging to Robert Miller and the other untraceable. But the pattern was clear. They had not only stolen her project, they had used its inflated success as a cover to embezzle a fortune from the company. Their greed had been their undoing. Alara received the final, comprehensive report from Flores in a sealed envelope. She read it in the quiet of her uncle's study, the pages detailing a level of corruption and deceit that was even worse than she had imagined. The report was not a collection of theories or interpretations. It was a portfolio of undeniable, prosecutable facts. As she sat there, the weight of the evidence on the desk in front of her, she felt a strange, cold calm. Her personal quest for justice had uncovered a deep sickness at the heart of the company. Throughout this period, her demeanor at Innovate Dynamics remained one of serene, professional curiosity. She continued her duties as a board member, giving no indication of the storm that was about to break. One afternoon, she found herself sharing an elevator with Liam. He was beaming, radiating the easy confidence of a man who believed he was invincible. "Miss Vance Sterling," he said, giving her a familiar, charming smile. "Great to see you. We're getting some incredible results from the Chimera platform. The Q4 projections are going to be astronomical." He was trying to network with her, to impress the powerful new board member. Alara met his gaze, her expression placid. "Is that so, Mr. Kent?" she replied, her voice perfectly even. "I will be very interested to see the final numbers." He had no idea he was a dead man walking. He couldn't feel the fine, invisible threads of the net that were already wrapped around him, pulling tight. The summons came via a sterile, high-priority email sent from the office of the CEO. An extraordinary meeting of the board of directors was being convened to review the findings of the recent independent audit. The meeting was mandatory for all board members and senior executives. A special addendum noted that Marcus Thorne and Liam Kent were also required to attend to provide a final status update on the successful rollout of Project Chimera. To them, it must have felt like a summons to their own coronation. They walked into the 40th floor boardroom with the easy confidence of men who believed they were untouchable, exchanging smiles and a self-congratulatory nod. They were expecting a victory lap, perhaps even the announcement of a significant bonus. Their confidence faltered for only a second when they saw Alara Vance Sterling seated not at the side of the long mahogany table, but at its head, directly to the right of the CEO, Charles Kensington. A folder lay closed on the table in front of her. The room was tense. The usual pre-meeting chatter was absent, replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. Kensington began, his face a grim, unreadable mask. "Thank you for joining us," he said, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. "As you know, the board recently commissioned a comprehensive audit of our R&D division, Miss &AD. Vance Sterling, as the initiator of this motion, will present a summary of the findings." He gestured to Alara. She stood, the calm in the eye of a hurricane she herself had created. She was not the nervous, unassuming analyst they had once known. She was a figure of pure, cold authority. She picked up a remote, and the large screen at the end of the room flickered to life. The first slide was simple, written in a stark, white font against a black background. "Argent Forensics Audit, Key Findings." "Good morning," Alara began, her voice steady and clear, projecting through the silent room. "The audit was extensive, but for the sake of time, I will focus on the most critical discoveries centered around the company's most recent flagship initiative, Project Chimera." She clicked the remote. The next slide was titled, Finding 1, Intellectual Property Authorship. A detailed timeline appeared on the screen, showing 2 parallel streams of data. One was a log of file creation and modification from a workstation assigned to E. Vance. The other, from a workstation assigned to L. Kent. The timestamps were undeniable. As you can see from the server logs, Alara narrated, her tone as neutral as if she were presenting weather data. The core architectural framework and foundational algorithms for Project Chimera were created, tested, and finalized between January and June of last year. The author of these files is logged as user E. Vance. User L. Kent was granted read, divided by write access to these directories for the first time on the 14th of July. 6 months after the project's inception, a wave of shock rippled through the room. The other board members stared at the screen, then at a rapidly paling Marcus and Liam. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, a blustering denial already forming on his lips, but Alara continued without pause, giving him no opportunity. Furthermore, she said, clicking to the next slide, which showed recovered fragments of emails, forensic analysis of the email server archives shows detailed communications from E. Vance to L. Kent, explaining the project's core concepts long before Mr. Kent's official involvement. The color had completely drained from Liam's face. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. The project, his entire career, was built on a lie that was now being forensically dismantled in front of the most powerful people in the company. Alara paused, letting the weight of the intellectual property theft sink in. Marcus was now sweating, his eyes darting between Alara and the CEO. He was beginning to understand that this was not a simple complaint, it was an execution. However, Alara said, her voice dropping slightly, drawing everyone's focus, the theft of intellectual property, as serious as it is not the most disturbing finding of this audit. She clicked the remote again. The slide now read, Finding 2, Financial Malfeasance and Embezzlement. A complex flowchart appeared on the screen, showing the Innovate Dynamics logo at the top, an arrow pointing down to the Project Chimera budget, and from there, a thick red line leading to a box with the name Kent Strategic Solutions, LLC. The audit uncovered a series of highly irregular payments made from the Chimera budget to a third-party consultant, Alara explained. This consultant, Kent Strategic Solutions, billed the company for over $400,000 for vague services that were never rendered. It is a shell corporation registered to a P.O. box. Its sole officer is a Mr. Robert Miller. She clicked again. A photo of Liam appeared on the screen, next to a photo of another man. Mr. Robert Miller, she said, is Liam Kent's brother-in-law. A collective gasp went through the room. This was no longer an internal dispute. This was a criminal conspiracy. Liam looked like he was about to be physically sick. Marcus was stunned into silence, his face a mask of pure terror. They were exposed, their greed laid bare for all to see. But Alara was not finished. There was one final act. One might assume, she continued, her voice now laced with ice, that this was simply a case of common corporate fraud. But the evidence suggests a more treacherous motive. She clicked to the final, devastating slide. It contained a screenshot of an encrypted chat log, recovered from the deep memory cache of Liam's workstation. The participants were an anonymous user and someone from the IP address of their main competitor, Sibnatech. The message, decrypted by the Argent team, was chillingly clear. Asset is secure and fully functional, ready for transfer. Awaiting final payment and extraction plan. Alara lowered the remote and looked directly at the CEO. It appears the embezzlement wasn't just about greed, Mr. Kensington. It was seed money. The final phase of their plan was to sell our most valuable new asset, the core algorithm of Project Chimera, to our biggest rival. The room exploded. The pretense of corporate decorum vanished, replaced by raw, visceral fury. The board members were shouting. The CEO, Charles Kensington, rose to his feet, his face purple with rage. He stared at Marcus and Liam, two men he had trusted and promoted, as if they were vermin. Island this. True? He roared, his voice shaking with fury. Marcus, finally finding his voice, sputtered, No, this island, this is a fabrication, a misunderstanding. This woman, Alara, didn't even flinch. She simply spoke into the chaos with unshakable calm. The full, unredacted report from Argent Forensics, including all server logs, bank records, and the complete chat log, has just been digitally distributed to each board member's secured tablet. I invite you to verify the facts for yourselves. It was the final move. Checkmate. There was nowhere left for them to run. Kensington stared at them for one more long, silent moment, his eyes filled with contempt. Then he turned his back on them and picked up his phone. "Security," he said, his voice deadly calm. "I need a team on the 40th floor immediately. We have 2 individuals who will be escorted from the premises. And get the general counsel on the line. Now." The sound of the heavy, approaching footsteps of the security team in the hallway was the only sound that mattered. It was the sound of justice, finally arriving. The silence that descended upon the boardroom in the wake of the CEO's call was heavier than any shout could ever be. It was the sound of absolute ruin. When the 2 security guards entered, their presence was a stark, physical manifestation of the new reality. There was no struggle. Marcus Thorne, the man of booming confidence and manipulative charm, seemed to have shrunk inside his expensive suit, his face a ghastly shade of gray. Liam Kent, the golden boy, was utterly broken, a hollow shell of the charismatic star he had been just minutes before. They were led out of the room, their walks of shame taking them past the glass walls of the executive floor, then down the elevator, and finally, through the open-plan office on the 34th floor, where Alara once Saturday, every head turned, every conversation stopped. The entire office bore silent witness as the 2 architects of the company's celebrated success were escorted out like common criminals, their fall from grace as swift and public as their ascent had been fraudulent. The purge that followed was swift and ruthless. Marcus and Liam were, of course, terminated immediately, their case handed over to the district attorney's office, where they would face a litany of federal charges ranging from wire fraud to conspiracy and economic espionage. Brenda, the impassive gatekeeper of HR, was summoned to the CEO's office the next morning. For her, there was no dramatic confrontation, just a cold, quiet dismissal for gross negligence. Her failure to act, her complicity in protecting the powerful over the powerless, had made her a liability the company could no longer afford. The system she had so callously served had, in the end, turned and devoured her too. A week later, Charles Kensington summoned Alara to his office. The man who had once sized her up with wary skepticism now looked at her with a potent mixture of respect and awe. "Alara," he began, "foregoing any formality, you have saved this company from a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. You operated with a level of integrity and strategic brilliance that I have rarely seen." He slid a formal offer letter across his desk. The title was Vice President of Strategic Innovation, a new role created for her, a position with sweeping authority over the company's future direction, and a salary that made her breath catch in her throat. She accepted, not with triumphant glee, but with the quiet, somber gravity of someone accepting a great and heavy responsibility. Her new office was a corner suite on the 40th floor, with a view that spanned the entire city. It was Marcus Thorne's old office. The irony was not lost on her. As she spent her first evening there, long after the rest of the building had emptied out, she began to unpack the small box of personal items she had brought from her uncle's apartment. At the bottom was a simple, unlabeled USB stick that his lawyer, Mr. Sterling, had given her, saying only that Arthur had wanted her to have it. Driven by curiosity, she plugged it into her new laptop. There was only one file on it, a video file named For Alara. She clicked play. Her uncle's face, looking tired but gentle, filled the screen. He was sitting in his familiar armchair, a blanket over his lap. "Hello, my dear Alara," he began, his voice weak but clear. "If you are watching this, it means I am gone. And it probably means that you have found yourself in a position of power I always knew you were capable of, but hoped you would never need." He took a breath. "There is something I must tell you. A story I should have told you long ago. It's about a man named Marcus Thorne." Alara froze, her hand hovering over the trackpad. "Years ago, during the acquisition of my company," Arthur continued, "Marcus was the ambitious young manager assigned to oversee the transition. He was charming, and I was naive. He saw my quiet nature, not as a virtue, but as a weakness to be exploited. He took credit for my architectural insights, passed off my ideas as his own, and used them to climb the corporate ladder. He was the one who ultimately pushed me out, framing me as difficult and uncooperative. I didn't have the tools or the temperament to fight him in his world, so I left. But I kept my shares, and I kept my seat on the board. A silent emergency brake. He looked directly into the camera, his eyes filled with a deep, sad love. I am telling you this not to burden you with my old battles, but so you understand. This inheritance, this power, it was not an accident. I saw the darkness in that man, and I suspected that a man like that does not change. I worried that one day, his ambition might lead him to hurt you too. I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you in life, my girl. But I hoped that, if the worst should happen, I could leave you the tools to find justice for yourself. A single, silent tear traced a path down Alara's cheek. Her calculated plan, her cold-blooded quest for justice, was suddenly reframed into something far more profound. It was not revenge. It was the completion of a circle. It was an act of love, a final gift from the man who had raised her. She closed the laptop and walked to the vast window, looking down at the endless river of lights that was the city. They thought they had buried her, but they didn't know she was a seed, planted in the fertile ground of her uncle's quiet, patient legacy. Never underestimate the silence of someone who has endured too much. For in that silence, they are not breaking, they are sharpening. Her new purpose was clear. She would not rule with the arrogance of a Marcus Thorne or the deceit of a Liam Kent. She would lead with the quiet, unshakable integrity of an Arthur Vance. She would use her power to build a place where the brilliant, the quiet, the dedicated would never again be silenced, erased, or destroyed. The corporate world is full of ghosts, ghosts of broken promises and forgotten talents. What happens when one of those ghosts comes back to claim what's theirs? Join us next time for another story from the front lines of the office.